Everyone in Astoria, Oregon, thought they knew what happened to the Holmeses and the Gibbons. Two couples, four adults, vanished after a Sunday fishing trip in August 1968. Their truck sat in the parking lot with the keys still in the ignition and fresh-caught trout cooling in the cooler. The boat they'd rented was found drifting 3 miles downstream, empty. For 42 years, the prevailing theory was simple. They'd drowned in the Columbia River during a sudden squall, and the current had carried their bodies out to the Pacific. The families held memorial services. The children grew up without parents. The case file gathered dust in a basement archive. But in 2010, a retired history teacher comparing old harbor maps to modern satellite images noticed something that didn't add up. The parking lot where that Ford pickup had been found didn't exist anymore. It had been buried under tons of concrete and gravel in 1971, part of a harbor expansion project that nobody had thought to connect to 4 missing people. What lay beneath that concrete would prove that Robert Holmes, Jennifer Holmes, Frank Gibbons, and Mary Gibbons hadn't drowned at all, and the person responsible for their deaths had spent 4 decades hiding in plain sight. If you believe the truth always surfaces, no matter how deep it's buried, subscribe to this channel, because some secrets stay hidden until someone cares enough to look at an old map. Part 1. August 18, 1968. The morning started the way it always did for the Holmeses and the Gibbons, early, with thermoses of coffee and tackle boxes loaded into Robert Holmes's green Ford F-100. By 6 a.m., they were pulling out of Exchange Street in Astoria, Oregon, heading for Pier 9. Robert Holmes, 38, worked as a foreman at the Bumblebee Seafoods cannery down by the waterfront. He was a compact, muscular man with permanent creases around his eyes from squinting into the sun and a reputation for being fair with his crew. His wife, Jennifer, 35, taught 2nd grade at Astoria Elementary. She had dark blonde hair she kept short for practicality, and a warm laugh that put nervous children at ease. Frank Gibbons, 42, was taller and leaner than Robert, with thinning brown hair and large, calloused hands from 30 years of carpentry work. He'd built half the kitchen cabinets in Astoria, and people said you could trust Frank Gibbons's measurements more than you could trust a surveyor's. His wife, Mary, 40, worked part-time at the Clatsop County Public Library and spent her free time tending to a garden that produced tomatoes the size of softballs. The two families had been friends since Robert and Frank met in 1955 while working construction on the new bridge across Young's Bay. They'd discovered a shared passion for fishing, and for 13 years, almost every Sunday from May through September, they'd head out to the Columbia River together. They had 7 children between them: Michael and Sarah Holmes, 13 and 9, Patricia, David, and Elizabeth Gibbons, 16, 14, and 11. None of those children would see their parents alive again. This particular Sunday, they planned to fish the sloughs near Tongue Point, where the steelhead had been running thick all week. "You think we'll beat last week?" Frank asked as he secured the tackle boxes in the truck bed. The previous Sunday, they'd brought home 23 trout between them. "With the reports I've been hearing, we might double it," Robert said, tightening a rope around the cooler. Jennifer climbed into the cab next to Mary, both women wearing practical cotton shirts and dungarees. "I don't care if we catch anything," Jennifer said. "I just want 6 hours without someone asking me where their shoes are." Mary laughed. "Or why the bathroom sink is leaking." "I fixed that sink," Frank protested. "It's leaking again." The morning was cool and overcast, typical for August in Astoria, with a light fog hanging over the river. The temperature sat around 58 degrees. They drove through town, past the shuttered storefronts on Commercial Street and the weathered Victorian houses climbing the hillside. Astoria in 1968 was a working-class town of about 11,000 people built on salmon fishing, timber, and the steady traffic of ships navigating between the Pacific Ocean and the inland ports along the Columbia. They reached Pier 9 at 6:45. The old dock jutted out into the harbor like a crooked finger, its weathered wooden pilings crusted with barnacles and draped with seaweed. Built in 1923, Pier 9 had once been a busy loading dock for lumber shipments, but by the late 1960s it was mostly used by recreational fishermen and the occasional small commercial boat. Harold Went, the harbor master, was sitting in his small shack when they pulled up, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He was 61, a former merchant marine with a face like tanned leather. "Morning, Bob. Frank," Harold said, stubbing out his cigarette. "Heading to Tongue Point?" "That's the plan," Robert said, handing over $2 bills for the parking. "You hear how they're biting out there?" "Real good, from what I hear. Pete Hernandez came back yesterday with a full box." Harold wrote out a parking receipt. "You want me to reserve this spot for when you get back? I got a boat club coming in around 3, and they'll fill up the lot." "We should be back by 4 at the latest," Robert said. "But yeah, that'd be appreciated." Harold made a note on his clipboard. "You folks be careful out there. Current's running strong this week." The boat was in good condition, a serviceable 16-footer with a 20-horsepower Evinrude outboard motor and bench seats for 4. Frank checked the fuel tank while Robert inspected the life jackets. They loaded their gear: 4 fishing rods, 3 tackle boxes, the cooler packed with sandwiches and beer, a portable radio, and a first aid kit. At 7:15, they cast off. Robert took the motor, steering them out of the harbor and into the main channel of the Columbia River. The fog was starting to lift, revealing the green hills on the Washington side. They reached the sloughs near Tongue Point 40 minutes later. Robert cut the engine and let the boat drift, while Frank cast the first line. Within 5 minutes, he had a strike. The rod bent sharply, and Frank worked the reel with practiced efficiency, bringing in a fat steelhead that had to weigh at least 8 pounds. "There we go," Frank said, grinning as he netted the fish. "That's number 1. For the next 6 hours they fished in comfortable silence, broken occasionally by conversation about nothing important: the upcoming school year, whether the Astoria High football team would make the playoffs, the rising cost of groceries. The fish were biting well. By 1 o'clock they had 19 trout and steelhead in the cooler, all good-sized keepers. They ate lunch around 1:30, drifting in a quiet backwater while they demolished Jennifer's tuna sandwiches and drank cold Olympia beer. The sun had burned off the morning fog, and the temperature had climbed to a pleasant 65 degrees. "This is perfect," Mary said. "We should do this every day." "Can't afford to," Frank said. "Somebody's got to pay for those tomato plants." They fished for another hour, adding 5 more fish to their tally. At 3 o'clock, Robert checked his watch. "We should probably start heading back. Current'll be against us, and I want to get these cleaned before dinner." No one argued. They reeled in their lines, secured the gear, and started the motor. The trip back took longer. The Columbia's current was strong, and the little outboard had to work hard to push them upstream. By 3:45, they could see Pier 9 ahead, its weathered pilings dark against the afternoon sun. There were more boats at the dock now, including a cluster of small sailboats. At 3:45, they approached Pier 9. Robert throttled down, bringing the aluminum boat in careful and slow the way he always did. Frank stood at the bow, ready to grab the mooring line. They were 10 feet from the dock. Then Harold heard it, a crack like a gunshot. One of the main support pilings tilted. Then, with a sound like thunder, a 20-foot section of the pier collapsed into the water. Wooden planks, metal railings, massive pilings, all of it came down in 3 seconds. The boat was directly underneath. A piling 3 feet in diameter crashed through the hull like a spear through paper. The boat folded in half. Another section of decking landed on top, driving everything underwater. The wreckage pinned all 4 of them beneath 12 feet of murky river water. Harold ran for the marine radio, his hands shaking. "Mayday, mayday! Pier collapse! 4 people in the water!" By the time the Coast Guard arrived 8 minutes later, there was no one to save. The bodies were recovered the next day. Frank Gibbons, pinned beneath a piling that had driven through his torso. Mary, her body tangled in ropes and caught beneath a section of decking. Jennifer, crushed beneath the boat's hull. Finally, at 1:15 p.m., Robert. All 4 bodies showed massive trauma consistent with being struck by falling debris. The medical examiner, Dr. Arthur Sutton, conducted the autopsies that evening. His report was clinical. Multiple blunt force injuries, crushing trauma to chest and abdomen, evidence of drowning in 2 cases. Time of death, approximately 3:50 p.m., August 18, 1968. The funerals were held on Saturday, August 24th. The whole town turned out. Bumblebee Seafoods closed for the day so Robert's co-workers could attend. The school district sent a representative to speak about Jennifer's dedication to her students. Frank's carpentry customers filled 2 pews at the Methodist church. The children sat in the front row, 7 young people suddenly without parents. Michael Holmes sat rigid and silent, his arm around Sarah, who clutched a stuffed rabbit their mother had bought her for Christmas. Patricia Gibbons held her younger siblings' hands, her face pale but composed. They were a family now, bound by shared loss. Sheriff Tom Drayton stood in the back, a heavy-set man in his 50s with iron-gray hair. He'd completed his investigation the day before, and the findings weren't good for anyone involved. The engineering report from the Oregon Department of Transportation was damning. The pilings that had supported the collapsed section showed extensive rot, particularly at the waterline where constant moisture had broken down the wood. Several pilings had lost more than 60% of their structural integrity. The engineers estimated the pier had been in dangerous condition for at least 5 years. More troubling were the inspection records, or lack thereof. Wallace Kern had finally produced documents claiming the pier had been inspected in 1966 and found to be in acceptable condition. But when Drayton contacted the inspector listed on the form, a retired engineer named Donald Price had no memory of inspecting Pier 9. "I did a lot of piers that year," Price said, "but if I'd seen rot like you're describing, I would have red-tagged it immediately. Are you sure my name is on that report?" Drayton was sure. Someone had falsified the inspection, probably Kern or someone in the Port Authority's office, but proving it was another matter. Price's memory wasn't reliable enough to testify in court, and without physical evidence of forgery, it would be Kern's word against circumstantial suspicion. Drayton presented his findings to the district attorney, Martin Holbrook, on August 27th. They met in Holbrook's office on the 3rd floor of the courthouse, where Holbrook chain-smoked Paul Malls while reading through the report. "This is bad, Tom," Holbrook said finally. 4 people dead because somebody didn't want to spend money on pier maintenance. "Can we prosecute?" Drayton asked. Holbrook stubbed out his cigarette. "For what? Negligence, maybe, but that's civil, not criminal. We'd need to prove criminal negligence or manslaughter, and that requires showing that Kern or someone else knew the pier was dangerous and deliberately allowed people to use it anyway. That inspection report is falsified." "Probably, but can you prove it? Can you prove Kern knew it was falsified?" Holbrook lit another cigarette. "Look, I'll contact the state attorney general's office. Maybe they can build something. But realistically, This is going to end with the Port Authority paying a settlement to the families and nobody going to jail. He was right. The state investigation dragged on for 4 months, but in the end, no criminal charges were filed. In December 1968, the Port Authority settled with the Holmes and Gibbons families for a total of $60,000, $15,000 per victim. The money came from the Port Authority's insurance policy, not from Wallace Kern or anyone else involved. Pier 9 was demolished in January 1969. The Port Authority cited safety concerns and announced plans to rebuild the Eastern Harbor area with modern facilities. The case was officially closed on January 15, 1969. The final report, filed by Sheriff Drayton, concluded 4 deaths by accidental drowning due to structural collapse of Pier 9, Astoria Harbor. Contributing factors: inadequate pier maintenance and falsified safety inspection. No criminal charges filed. Drayton filed the report in the county archives and tried to move on. But he couldn't forget the sight of those 7 children at the funeral. The Holmes and Gibbons children grew up marked by that August day. Michael Holmes became withdrawn and angry. At 13, he'd been old enough to understand what happened, but too young to do anything about it. He acted out in school, getting into fights, skipping classes. His aunt in Portland, who'd taken custody of him and Sarah, didn't know how to reach him. When Michael turned 16 in 1971, he did something that would define his relationship with authority for the rest of his life. He walked into the Clatsop County Sheriff's office and demanded to speak to someone about his parents' deaths. The deputy on duty was young, new to the job. He listened to Michael's story with growing discomfort. "That pier was fine for years," Michael said, his voice tight with anger. "People used it every weekend. Then one day it just happens to collapse exactly when my parents are bringing their boat in. You don't find that suspicious?" "The investigation concluded it was structural failure," the deputy said carefully. "The pilings were rotted." "If they were so rotted, why didn't the pier collapse before? Why that exact moment?" The deputy had no answer. "Look, son, I understand you're upset, but the case was closed 3 years ago. The state attorney general's office reviewed it. If there was evidence of a crime, they would have prosecuted." "What about the inspection? It was falsified, right? Isn't that a crime?" "That's complicated. The person who supposedly did the inspection couldn't remember one way or the other. Without proof of forgery—" "This is bullshit," Michael said, standing up. His chair scraped loudly on the linoleum floor. "My parents are dead, my sister and I are orphans, and nobody's going to do anything because it's complicated." The deputy stood too, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt. "You need to calm down." "Don't tell me to calm down. My parents were murdered, and you're all just okay with that." "Nobody said they were murdered. It was an accident." "It wasn't an accident," Michael's voice cracked. "It couldn't have been. The timing was too perfect. Somebody wanted that pier to collapse." The deputy's supervisor emerged from a back office, attracted by the raised voices. He was older, had been around during the original investigation. He recognized Michael's last name. "Mr. Holmes," the supervisor said, his tone gentler. "I understand your frustration. I really do. But we can't reopen a case based on feelings. We need evidence, hard evidence of criminal activity. Do you have anything like that?" Michael sagged. "No." "Then I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do." Michael left the sheriff's office that day feeling hollowed out. He'd known, intellectually, that they wouldn't help him. But some part of him had hoped, had believed that if he just explained it clearly enough, someone would listen. 6 months later, he joined the Navy. He never came back to Astoria. The town moved on. The demolished pier sat empty for 3 years, broken pilings gradually disappearing beneath silt. In 1971, the Port Authority began a harbor expansion project, filling in the eastern harbor to create additional parking. They didn't remove the wreckage, they buried it. A memo from April 1971 explained why. Estimate for clearing debris $47,000. Recommend incorporating debris into fill base instead. Will save time and reduce costs. Wallace Kern signed off on it. By 1972, 3 feet of gravel and concrete covered the site where 4 people had died. Asphalt paving went on top. Cars parked there every day, their drivers having no idea what lay beneath. The case file moved to the county archives. Case 68-247. Holmes, Gibbons pier collapse. One box among hundreds, gathering dust in a basement. Wallace Kern retired in 1976 and moved to Arizona. Harold Went died in 1982. Sheriff Tom Drayton retired in 1988 and died in 2003, never having forgotten. By 2010, almost no one in Astoria remembered the pier collapse. The children who'd lost parents were adults now, scattered across the country. The parking lot sat undisturbed, its secret safe beneath tons of fill. The case was closed. The truth, everyone assumed, had been discovered. Everyone was wrong. March 2010. David Porter sat in the Clatsop County Historical Society comparing maps for his retirement project, a comprehensive history of Astoria's commercial waterfront from 1900 to 2000. Porter was 62, a methodical man who'd taught American history at Astoria High for 38 years. He'd grown up in Astoria, left for college in Portland, and returned to teach in his hometown. He knew the city's history better than almost anyone alive, and he'd been planning this book for a decade. The Historical Society had given him access to their entire archive, shipping records, harbor maps, photographs, business directories, newspaper clippings. Porter had been working through the material since January, taking careful notes and cross-referencing documents. On this particular Tuesday morning, he was comparing 2 maps of the Eastern Harbor. One was a 1965 Coast and Geodetic Survey chart showing the layout of commercial piers. The other was a 2005 Google Earth satellite image he'd printed out. He was trying to identify which modern structures corresponded to which historical piers. He'd been staring at the maps for 10 minutes when he noticed something odd. On the 1965 chart, there was a clear marking for Pier 9 extending about 60 feet into the harbor with a boat launch on the north side. But on the 2005 satellite image, there was nothing in that location, just parking lot. That wasn't unusual in itself. Piers had been demolished and rebuilt constantly over the decades, but Porter was meticulous about his research, and he wanted to know what had happened to Pier 9. He checked his notes. The pier had been built in 1923, he knew that. But when had it been torn down? He went to the Historical Society's newspaper archive and started searching through old issues of the Daily Astorian, the bound volumes smelling of old paper and mildew. It took him an hour of careful page-turning, but he finally found a brief article from January 1969, Port Authority to Demolish Damaged Pier 9. The article was short, barely 3 paragraphs. It mentioned that Pier 9 had been damaged in an accident in 1968 and would be demolished for safety reasons. The Port Authority planned to rebuild the area as part of a harbor expansion project. That was all. Porter made a note in his research notebook and continued searching. But something nagged at him. An accident in 1968? What kind of accident? The article had mentioned damage, but hadn't specified the cause. He went back to the newspaper archive and searched for August 1968. He found it on page 1 of the August 19, 1968 edition, 4 missing after pier collapse. Porter read the article slowly, then read it again. 4 people dead when a pier collapsed. The pier had been structurally unsound. There'd been an investigation. He continued searching and found follow-up articles over the next week. Bodies recovered from harbor wreckage. Families to sue Port Authority. Investigation finds pier inspection falsified. By the time he finished reading the entire series of articles, it was past noon. Porter sat back in his chair at the long research table, trying to process what he'd learned. He'd lived in Astoria his entire life, except for his college years. How had he not known about this? 4 people killed in a pier collapse was major news, even in 1968. But 1968 had been 42 years ago. Porter would have been 20 years old, away at college in Portland. He'd probably been too absorbed in his own life, classes, his part-time job at Powell's Books, his girlfriend who would later become his wife, to pay attention to hometown news. And by the time he moved back to Astoria in 1972 to start teaching, the pier was already gone and the case was old news, absorbed into the town's collective past. He pulled out more maps. A 1970 planning document showed Pier 9 marked to be demolished. Then a 1972 engineering diagram showed the completed harbor expansion. The pier area was now filled in, extending the shoreline 40 feet. The fill material, gravel and broken concrete, topped with asphalt. Porter measured carefully. The pier had been buried. Not removed. Buried. That seemed wrong. Wouldn't they clear wreckage before filling in a harbor? Wouldn't there be pilings, debris, structural remains? He drove to the Port Authority's records office that afternoon. 2 hours of searching through dusty files produced the construction contract from March 1971, Pacific Northwest Marine Construction. Removal of existing structures and fill of eastern harbor area. But the inspection reports made no mention of removing the pier. They referred to existing debris being incorporated into fill base layer. They'd just buried everything. Porter found the explanation in an April 1971 memo. Regarding removal of Pier 9 wreckage, estimate for clearing debris $47,000. Recommend incorporating debris into fill base instead. Will save time and reduce costs. Debris sufficiently compacted by recent sediment accumulation. Structural integrity of new paving will not be affected. Wallace Kern's signature was at the bottom. Porter sat back. 4 people had died when that pier collapsed. The investigation found corruption and falsified records, and then they'd buried all the physical evidence under a parking lot to save money. That evening he spread out his documents at home. His wife Margaret brought coffee. 4 people died in a pier collapse in 1968, Porter explained. The wreckage is still there. They just paved over it. Is that unusual? I think so. I need to find out. He spent the next week calling engineers and construction workers. The answer was clear. Standard practice in the 1970s would have been to remove underwater wreckage before filling. Debris could rot and shift, causing subsidence. There were safety issues, too. But Pacific Northwest Marine Construction had simply dumped fill on top and compacted it down. Everything, the pilings, the decking, the metal railings, the crushed boat, was still there. Porter called the Astoria Police Department in late March. After 3 transfers, he reached Detective Sarah Womack. I'm researching the 1968 pier collapse, Porter said. I found something strange. The wreckage site was filled in and paved over in 1971. The debris was never cleared. Okay, Womack said slowly. What are you asking me to investigate? 4 people died there. The physical evidence was buried instead of being documented. Don't you think that's worth looking at? Womack was quiet. Let me pull the case file. 2 weeks later, she called back. The case concluded accidental death, rotted pilings. The families got settlements. There's no indication of criminal activity beyond the falsified inspection, and the DA decided not to prosecute. But they buried the wreckage. That's unusual, but it doesn't change the facts. The bodies were recovered. Cause of death was determined. What if there was evidence they missed? Like what? Porter didn't have an answer. It just feels wrong. Mr. Porter, there's nothing to investigate. The case closed 42 years ago. I can't dig up a parking lot on a feeling. Porter thanked her and hung up, frustrated. Maybe she was right. Maybe he was seeing conspiracy where there was only bureaucratic corner-cutting, but he couldn't let it go. He decided to contact the families. It took a week, but he found Sarah Holmes Bradley in Beaverton. She was 49 now, a school counselor with 2 children. Porter explained about the buried wreckage. I thought you should know the site still exists, in a sense, just under concrete. Silence. Then, can I ask you something? Did you find anything suggesting it wasn't an accident? No, everything confirms structural failure. Why? My brother never believed it, Sarah said quietly. Michael. He said the timing was too convenient. The pier was fine for years, then it collapses exactly when our parents are underneath. He thought that was suspicious. Porter felt cold. What did he do? He went to the sheriff when he was 16. They told him the case was closed. He joined the Navy after that. Where is he now? San Diego. We don't talk much, but I can give you his number. Porter called Michael Holmes the next day. A gruff voice answered, Yeah? Porter explained his research. When he mentioned the buried wreckage, Michael's tone changed. I knew it. I knew they covered something up. I don't have evidence of a cover-up, Porter said carefully. That's what a cover-up looks like. They buried the evidence so nobody could look too closely. The investigation found the pier was rotted. Yeah, I read that, but if it was so bad, why didn't it collapse before? Why that exact moment when my dad was bringing the boat in? Porter had no answer. You find anything else? You call me, Michael said. And Mr. Porter, thank you for not forgetting. Porter hung up and stared at his documents. Michael had a point. Why that exact moment? He went through the engineering report again. Multiple pilings showed rot at the waterline. The pier had been dangerous for at least 5 years. From 1963 to 1968, hundreds of boats had used it without incident. Then, on August 18, 1968, it collapsed, killing 4 people. Pure chance? Or something else? One detail caught his eye. The report included photographs of the broken pilings. Most showed ragged breaks with splintered wood, typical of rot failure. But one piling showed something different, a relatively clean break at a 45-degree angle. The engineer's note, Piling 4 shows atypical failure pattern, possibly due to grain structure. Porter stared at the photograph. A clean break at 45 degrees. That didn't look like rot. It looked like the piling had been cut. He called an engineer friend. If you wanted to deliberately collapse a pier, how would you do it? That's a weird question. Humor me. You'd weaken key supports. Easiest way would be partial cuts below the waterline. Nobody would notice. When enough weight was on the pier, it would fail. Why? Porter's hands were shaking. He thanked his friend and hung up. This was speculation, connecting dots that might not be connected, but he couldn't ignore it. He called Detective Womack again. I need to show you something. 20 minutes later, he was at the police station, spreading documents on a conference table. He explained carefully, trying not to sound crazy. The pier collapsed exactly when the boat was underneath. The witness described a crack like a gunshot. One piling shows a clean break that doesn't match the others. And 3 years later, they buried all the evidence. Womack studied the photograph. This could be grain structure Stress fracture? Anything? But it could also be saw marks. You'd need an expert to determine that, which means digging up the parking lot, which means a court order, which means probable cause. Do you have evidence of a crime? Porter sagged. No. Then I can't help you. I'm sorry. He gathered his documents and left. That evening he wrote a detailed summary and filed it with the Historical Society. Maybe someday someone would care. He tried to go back to his book, but couldn't focus. Instead, he wrote about the Holmeses and the Gibbons, about 4 ordinary people who went fishing and never came home. Publishers rejected the manuscript. The market for local history was too narrow, they said. Porter set the project aside in June. Maybe it wasn't meant to be a book. Maybe it was just meant to be remembered. The summer passed. Porter tried to focus on other things: his grandchildren, his garden, the local historical society's annual fundraiser in July. But the pier collapse haunted him. He'd wake up at night thinking about that photograph of the broken piling, about Michael Holmes's anger, about 7 children losing their parents in 3 seconds. In late August, he attended a lecture at Portland State University about forensic engineering. The speaker, Dr. Rachel Kim, was a structural engineer who'd made a name for herself re-examining historical building failures. She discussed how modern analysis techniques could reveal details that original investigators had missed: compression patterns in concrete, stress fractures in steel, failure sequences in complex structures. Porter sat in the audience of about 50 people, mostly graduate students and professional engineers. Dr. Kim was in her early 40s, Korean-American, with an intensity that reminded Porter of his best students. She showed slide after slide of bridge collapses, building failures, industrial accidents. In each case, new technology and careful reanalysis had revealed crucial details: a weld that failed first, triggering a cascade, a design flaw that had been invisible in the original investigation, a maintenance issue that compounded over decades. After the lecture, Porter waited while Dr. Kim answered questions from students. When the room had mostly cleared, he approached her with his folder of documents. "Dr. Kim, can I ask you about a pier collapse from 1968? She looked tired. It had been a long lecture, but interested. "Of course. What do you have?" He showed her the engineering report and the photographs from the ODOT investigation. She studied them for several minutes at the podium, holding the black and white images up to the light, her expression growing more focused. "This is interesting," she said finally, pointing to the photograph of Piling 4 with a pen. "See this break pattern? It's very clean, almost too clean for rot failure." Porter's pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" "Rotted wood fails progressively. The fibers tear and splinter as the structure gives way. You get a ragged break surface, lots of fracture points." She traced the edge of the piling in the photo. "But this looks more like a saw cut that was then stressed to failure. The angle is consistent with someone cutting partway through from below, then letting the weight and tension do the rest. It's actually a fairly common sabotage technique. We see it in insurance fraud cases sometimes." "Could you prove that?" "I'd need to examine the actual piling." "Do you know where it is?" "Buried under a parking lot." Dr. Kim raised her eyebrows. "Well, that complicates things." She paused, still looking at the photographs. "Who buried it?" Porter explained the whole story: the investigation in 1968, the settlement with the families, the decision to fill in the harbor area in 1971 and bury the wreckage instead of removing it. Dr. Kim listened, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. "This is unusual," she said when he finished. "Very unusual. Burying evidence from a fatal accident? That wouldn't happen today. But in the early 70s, regulations were different. OSHA was brand new. Environmental impact studies weren't mandatory yet. It was possible to make decisions that would be unthinkable now. She flipped through the photographs again. If you could get permission to excavate, I'd be willing to examine whatever you find. Pro bono. This is exactly the kind of case that interests me. Historical, structural failures with potential forensic significance. I'm working on a book about engineering disasters, and this would make a fascinating chapter. Porter drove home to Astoria that evening feeling energized for the first time in months. He had an expert willing to help. Now he just needed a reason, a legal justification, to dig up that parking lot. He spent September trying to find leverage. He contacted the Oregon State Police, explaining about the photograph and Dr. Kim's analysis. They listened politely and told him to contact the Astoria Police Department. He called the state attorney general's office. They suggested he speak with the county district attorney. The district attorney's office said it was a local matter and referred him back to the police. Each agency gave him the same message, phrased slightly differently. Without new evidence of a crime, they couldn't justify reopening a 42-year-old case. The problem was circular. He needed to excavate the site to find evidence, but he needed evidence to get permission to excavate. Porter grew increasingly frustrated. He had a structural engineer willing to examine the wreckage. He had a photograph suggesting sabotage. He had Michael Holmes's testimony about the suspicious timing. He had documentation showing that evidence had been deliberately buried. But none of it was quite enough to meet the legal threshold for reopening a closed case. Then, in mid-September, something happened that changed everything. Then, in September 2010, he received a phone call from someone he'd never expected to hear from. "Mr. Porter, this is Wallace Kern." Porter almost dropped the phone. "Mr. Kern, I understand you've been researching the Pier 9 collapse." Kern's voice was thin and shaking, the voice of a very old man. "My grandson saw your name in a newspaper article about the Historical Society. He tracked down your number for me." "Why are you calling me?" "Because I'm 91 years old, Mr. Porter. I'm dying, pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me maybe 3 months, and I can't die with this on my conscience." Porter's heart was pounding. "With what on your conscience?" There was a long pause. Porter could hear Kern's labored breathing. "The pier collapse wasn't an accident," Kern said finally. "Those people were murdered, and I helped cover it up." Porter grabbed a pen with shaking hands. "Tell me everything." Kern took a rattling breath. "In 1967, I got an offer I couldn't refuse. A man named Victor Leland owned a commercial development company in Portland. He wanted to build a marina and shopping complex on Astoria's waterfront. But there was a problem. Pier 9 and the surrounding area were designated for commercial fishing only. The zoning couldn't be changed without a compelling reason." "So you created one," Porter said quietly. "Not me. Leland. He approached me in early 1968, said he needed that zoning changed, and he needed it done quietly. He offered me $50,000, more money than I'd make in 5 years as Port Authority director. All I had to do was falsify a few inspection reports and look the other way." "Look the other way while what?" Another pause. "I didn't know at first. Leland said he'd handle everything. All I needed to do was make sure the pier inspection showed it was safe, even though I knew it wasn't. The rot was extensive. The pier should have been condemned years earlier." "But you signed off on it anyway." "Yes." Kern's voice cracked. "I told myself nobody would get hurt. The pier was mostly used by recreational fishermen on weekends. I figured it would just slowly deteriorate until we could justify tearing it down and rezoning the area. That was the plan." "What changed?" "August 18th, 1968. I got a call from Leland that morning. He said, 'Today's the day. Make sure you're not anywhere near the harbor.' I didn't understand what he meant. Then, that afternoon, the pier collapsed. 4 people dead. Porter's hand was cramping from gripping the pen. Leland sabotaged the pier. Yes, I didn't learn the details until later. He hired someone, I never knew who, to cut partway through key support pilings below the waterline. Not enough to make the pier fail immediately, but enough that it would collapse under the right load at the right time. How did he know when people would be there? He didn't. He just waited until someone was in the wrong place. It could have been anyone. It happened to be the Holmeses and the Gibbons. Porter felt sick. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm dying, and I can't face whatever comes next with this secret. And because you've been asking questions. You found the memo about burying the wreckage, didn't you? Yes. That was me, too. After the collapse, I panicked. I knew if engineers examined those pilings too closely, they might find evidence of the cuts. So I convinced the Port Authority Board that removing the wreckage would be too expensive. We buried it instead. Buried the evidence. Do you have any proof of this? Any documentation? I kept one thing. Insurance, I suppose. A letter from Leland dated January 1969 thanking me for my assistance with the waterfront project and confirming the final payment. It's vague enough to be deniable, but in context, Kern trailed off. I'll mail it to you, along with a written statement of everything I just told you. I'm old and dying. They can't do much to me now. What about Leland? Is he still alive? I don't know. I haven't heard from him since 1972. He got his marina eventually, not exactly where he wanted it, but close enough. The Astoria waterfront was completely redeveloped in the 70s. He made millions. Kern started coughing, a deep, racking sound. When he could speak again, his voice was weaker. I've lived with this for 42 years, Mr. Porter. 4 people died because I was greedy. 7 children lost their parents. And I took money to help hide the truth. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want the truth to come out before I die. I'll make sure it does, Porter said. 3 days later, a FedEx package arrived. Inside was a single-page letter on Victor Leland Development Corporation letterhead dated January 15, 1969. Dear Wallace, thank you for your assistance with the waterfront project. As discussed, please find enclosed the final payment of $25,000. Your cooperation in resolving the complications from last August has been invaluable. I look forward to our continued partnership as the redevelopment moves forward. Best regards, Victor Leland. Also in the package was a 4-page handwritten statement from Kern detailing everything he'd told Porter. The bribe, the falsified inspections, the sabotage, the burial of evidence. He'd signed and dated it and had it notarized by someone at his retirement community. Porter sat at his kitchen table, staring at the documents. He finally had evidence. Real, documented evidence of murder and conspiracy. He called Detective Womack immediately. This time, she listened. Part 2. The meeting happened on a gray Monday morning, October 4, 2010, in a conference room at the Astoria Police Department. Present were Detective Sarah Womack, Lieutenant James Kowalski, David Porter, and 2 investigators from the Oregon State Police who'd driven down from Salem overnight after receiving Womack's urgent call. Porter spread the documents on the table. Kern's 4-page confession, the letter from Leland, the engineering report with the photograph of Piling 4, Dr. Rachel Kim's preliminary analysis. Detective Marcus Webb, the senior state investigator, read through everything methodically. He was in his 50s, with gray temples and the careful demeanor of someone who'd seen too many cases fall apart over procedural errors. First question, Webb said. Is Wallace Kern still alive? I'll call the retirement home, Porter said. He stepped into the hallway and dialed. The receptionist at Desert Gardens Retirement Community in Phoenix put him through to the nursing supervisor. "I'm calling about Wallace Kern," Porter said. "I spoke with him last week. Is he available?" There was a pause. "I'm sorry, Mr. Kern passed away 3 days ago, October 1st. His family is making funeral arrangements." Porter felt something tighten in his chest. "How did he die?" "Pancreatic cancer. He'd been in hospice care for several weeks. He went peacefully. May I ask who's calling?" Porter identified himself and explained that Kern had provided information about a criminal case. The supervisor confirmed that Kern had indeed had a document notarized on September 18th. She'd witnessed it herself, along with a notary named Patricia Morales. "Was he lucid when he signed it?" Porter asked. "Completely. He was very insistent about having it done properly. He said it was important." Porter returned to the conference room with the news. "Kern died October 1st, but the retirement home confirms he was lucid when he signed the statement." Webb tapped Kern's confession. "This is good. A dying declaration has special evidentiary weight. But Kern can't testify now, so we need corroboration." "The letter from Leland corroborates the payment," Womack said. "Partially. The language is vague enough that a defense attorney will argue it refers to legitimate consulting fees. We need physical evidence." "The pilings," Porter said. "Dr. Kim believes they were sabotaged. If we can excavate them and prove that—" "Then we have a case," Webb finished. "But excavating a Port Authority parking lot requires a warrant, which requires probable cause. Lieutenant Kowalski, what's your assessment?" Kowalski had been quiet, reading through the documents again. "I think we have probable cause. Kern's confession is specific and detailed. He names Leland, describes the method, explains the motive. Combined with the suspicious brake pattern in the engineering photos, that's enough to petition for an excavation warrant." "Who do we need to convince?" Webb asked. "The Clatsop County District Attorney," Kowalski said. "Margaret Chen. She's thorough and cautious, but she's also aggressive when she thinks there's a real case." They met with D.A. Chen that afternoon. She was 47, Chinese-American, with a reputation for winning difficult cases through meticulous preparation. She read through the evidence packet twice before speaking. "This is extraordinary," she said finally. "A deathbed confession alleging that a pier collapse 42 years ago was actually premeditated murder." "Do we have enough for a warrant?" Kowalski asked. Chen tapped the letter from Leland. "This letter is circumstantial, but in context it's damning. Combined with Kern's detailed confession and the photographic evidence of unusual failure patterns, yes, I think we have probable cause." "How do we proceed?" Webb asked. Chen stood and walked to her office window, looking out at the courthouse across the street. "We need to move carefully but quickly. Victor Leland, if he's still alive and if Kern's story is true, is a wealthy man with resources and connections. Once he learns we're investigating, he'll lawyer up, possibly flee the country." She turned back to face them. "Here's what I'm going to do. I'll call the Oregon Attorney General's office. If Leland is who Kern says he is, a major developer who's made millions, we need state resources. This is bigger than Clatsop County can handle alone." The Oregon Attorney General, Elizabeth Martinez, authorized a full investigation within 24 hours. By October 6th, a task force had been assembled. Forensic engineers from Oregon State University, archaeologists experienced in excavating submerged sites, additional investigators from the state police, and Dr. Rachel Kim, who flew in from California as a consulting expert. Detective Webb took charge of investigating Victor Leland himself. What he found was both helpful and daunting. Victor Leland was indeed alive, age 79, living in an estate in Lake Oswego worth an estimated $6 million. He'd founded Leland Development Corporation in 1962 and built it into one of the Pacific Northwest's largest commercial development firms. He'd retired as CEO in 1998, but remained chairman emeritus. His estimated net worth was $45 million. More troubling, Leland was well connected. He'd donated millions to political campaigns over the decades, served on the boards of the Portland Art Museum and Oregon Symphony, and had buildings named after him at 2 universities. He would have access to the best legal representation money could buy. On October 11th, Judge Patricia Sorensen signed the excavation warrant. The Port Authority, now under entirely new management, cooperated fully. They closed the eastern parking lot and erected privacy fencing around the worksite. The excavation began on October 15, 2010, 42 years and 58 days after the pier collapsed. The first challenge was locating the exact position of the wreckage. Porter's maps helped establish the general area, but the shoreline had changed significantly since 1968. A ground-penetrating radar team from Oregon State spent 2 days scanning the parking lot in a grid pattern, creating 3-dimensional images of what lay beneath the asphalt and gravel. On October 17th, they found it, a dense mass of debris approximately 15 feet below the surface, covering an area roughly 30 feet by 40 feet. The radar images showed long linear objects, pilings, along with tangled masses of smaller material. "That's it," Dr. Kim said, studying the radar printouts. "That's the collapsed pier." The actual excavation was painstaking. They couldn't just dig straight down. They needed to document everything in layers, like an archaeological site. A backhoe carefully removed the asphalt paving in sections. Then workers with shovels removed the gravel fill layer by layer, with archaeologists photographing and measuring as they went. On October 19th, 4 days into the excavation, they reached the first wooden piling. It emerged from the earth like a fossil from deep time, a massive cylinder of blackened wood, 3 feet in diameter, compressed and preserved by the weight of the fill above it. Dr. Kim supervised as it was carefully extracted using chains and a crane, then laid on plastic sheeting for examination. David Porter watched from behind the barrier tape, his heart pounding. After months of research and speculation, after the lucky discovery of the maps and the providential confession from Kern, it all came down to this: what the physical evidence would reveal. Dr. Kim worked for 3 hours that first day, photographing the piling from every angle, taking core samples of the wood, measuring the breakpoints with precision calipers. She worked with intense focus, occasionally calling over one of her graduate students to document a particular feature. When she finally stood up and walked over to where D.A. Chen, Detective Webb, and the assembled investigators were waiting, her expression was grim. "It's sabotage," she said without preamble. "Deliberate, calculated sabotage." She led them to the piling and directed a floodlight at the breakpoint. "See these marks? Tool marks, made by a 2-man crosscut saw. You can see the individual tooth striations if you look closely." She traced them with a gloved finger. "Whoever did this cut approximately 60% of the way through the piling at a calculated angle, then they stopped." Webb was filming everything with a high-definition video camera. "How can you be certain these are saw marks and not natural damage or deterioration?" Dr. Kim pointed to specific features. "Several reasons. First, the parallel striations are consistent with saw teeth moving through wood. Natural fracturing doesn't create this pattern. Second, look at the depth and angle. This cut starts at the northwest face of the piling and proceeds at a 45-degree angle toward the southeast. That's not how rot progresses. Third, and most telling, Look at the compression patterns in the wood fibers at the cut surface." She pulled out a magnifying loupe and handed it to Webb. "The wood fibers at the cut edge show distinct compression marks, evidence that they bore weight for an extended period after being cut. If this damage had occurred during the pier collapse or during the later demolition work, those compression patterns wouldn't exist. These cuts were made days or weeks before the collapse, while the pier was still standing and bearing load." Over the next 10 days, they excavated 3 more pilings from the collapsed section. All 3 showed the same pattern: deliberate cuts made from below the waterline, angled at precisely calculated degrees, stopped before complete severance. On October 29th, Dr. Kim presented her findings to the task force in a formal briefing at the DA's office. "Whoever sabotaged this pier knew exactly what they were doing," she said, displaying photographs on a projection screen. "This wasn't random vandalism. This was structural engineering applied for malicious purposes." She clicked through images showing the cuts on each piling. "The person or persons who did this calculated precisely how much material to remove to weaken the structure without causing immediate collapse. They knew about load-bearing capacity, stress distribution, and failure points. This is sophisticated work." "How long would it have taken," D.A. Chen asked, "to cut through 4 pilings to this extent, working underwater?" Dr. Kim considered. "A 2-man crosscut saw can cut through green wood fairly quickly, but underwater work is much slower. You're working in limited visibility. You need to surface regularly for air. The saw binds more easily. I'd estimate at least 6 to 8 hours of actual cutting time, probably spread over multiple sessions." "So this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act," Webb said. "No, this was carefully planned and methodically executed. The person who did this probably worked at night, between midnight and dawn, when nobody would be at the pier. They would have needed a boat to position themselves, diving equipment, or at least the ability to hold their breath for extended periods, and significant physical strength. This was hard, dangerous work." D.A. Chen looked at the photographs. "And after they cut the pilings, they just waited?" "Yes, and that's the truly cold-blooded part. They didn't know who would be on the pier when it finally collapsed. They didn't care. They just needed it to fail catastrophically enough to force change." While Dr. Kim analyzed the physical evidence, Detective Webb had been building a case against Victor Leland. He'd subpoenaed financial records going back to 1968, interviewed former employees of Leland Development Corporation, and traced the history of waterfront development in Astoria. What he found supported Kern's confession in disturbing detail. In 1967 and early 1968, Leland Development Corporation had indeed submitted multiple proposals to the Astoria City Council for a large-scale marina and commercial complex on the waterfront. All had been rejected. The council minutes showed consistent opposition based on preserving the working waterfront character. Then, in September 1968, 1 month after the pier collapse, the City Council approved a comprehensive waterfront redevelopment plan that included provisions for mixed-use commercial development. By 1973, Leland Development Corporation had built the Astoria Bay Marina, a 200-slip facility with associated retail and restaurant space. Financial records showed that Wallace Kern had indeed received 2 payments from a Leland Development Corporation account in 1968, $25,000 in January and $25,000 in February 1969. Both were categorized as consulting fees. Most damning, Webb found a 1972 interview with Leland in Pacific Northwest Business Journal where he discussed his Astoria project. One quote stood out: "Sometimes tragedy opens doors that politics keeps closed. The pier collapse was a wake-up call for Astoria about the need to modernize its infrastructure." On November 2, 2010, D.A. Chen made the decision to charge Victor Leland with 4 counts of murder in the first degree. "We have physical evidence of sabotage," she told the assembled task force. "We have a detailed confession from Kern naming Leland as the person who ordered it. We have documentary evidence of payments. We have a clear motive and a pattern of benefiting from the deaths. It's time." The arrest was planned carefully. Leland was elderly and wealthy, with resources to flee if he learned he was under investigation. They would move at dawn, quickly and quietly. On November 3, 2010, at 6:30 a.m., Detective Webb and 3 other state police investigators drove to Leland's estate in Lake Oswego. They were accompanied by agents from the FBI's Portland field office, brought in to prevent any possibility of flight. The house was spectacular, ultra-modern architecture, all glass and steel, perched on a hillside overlooking the lake. The morning sun was just touching the water when Webb rang the doorbell. Victor Leland answered the door himself. He was tall and straight for 79, with thick white hair and the kind of tan that spoke of recent time in warmer climates. He wore slacks and a cashmere sweater and looked like what he was, a wealthy man in comfortable retirement. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but puzzled. Webb showed his badge and the arrest warrant. "Victor Leland, I'm Detective Marcus Webb with the Oregon State Police. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of 4 counts of murder in the first degree." For just a moment something flickered across Leland's face. Not surprise, exactly. More like resignation, as if he'd known this day might come eventually. Then his expression smoothed into careful neutrality. "I'd like to call my attorney." "You can do that at the station, sir. Right now, I need you to come with us." Leland didn't resist. He asked permission to get a jacket and his phone, both granted under supervision. As they walked him to the unmarked car, a neighbor watering his lawn stopped and stared. Leland was processed at the Clatsop County Jail and arraigned that afternoon. His attorney, Richard Holloway, was already present, one of Portland's most prominent criminal defense lawyers, probably on retainer. Holloway argued forcefully for bail. "Your Honor, my client is a 79-year-old man with no criminal record who has lived in Oregon his entire life. He's a pillar of the community, a philanthropist who's donated millions to charitable causes. He has deep roots here. He's not a flight risk." D.A. Chen countered, "Your Honor, Mr. Leland is charged with 4 counts of premeditated murder. The evidence shows he orchestrated the sabotage of a public pier, resulting in the deaths of Robert Holmes, Jennifer Holmes, Frank Gibbons, and Mary Gibbons. He did this to advance his business interests, and he succeeded. He built a multi-million-dollar marina on the site where those people died. He has the means to flee the country, and given the severity of the charges, 4 life sentences, he has every incentive to do so." Judge Sorensen took 15 minutes to make her decision. "Bail is denied. Mr. Leland will remain in custody pending trial." The news broke within hours. By evening, every major news outlet in Oregon was leading with the story. The Oregonian's headline read, "Prominent developer charged in 1968 pier collapse deaths." The story went national the next day. NBC Nightly News ran a segment. The New York Times wrote an analysis piece. "Oregon Cold Case, When Development Turns Deadly." David Porter's phone didn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted interviews. True crime producers wanted him for their shows. A literary agent from New York called about book rights. But the call Porter cared about most came on November 5th from Michael Holmes. "Mr. Porter, I saw the news. Is it real? Did they actually arrest the guy who killed my parents?" Porter could hear the tremor in Michael's voice, hope and fear and 42 years of anger all mixed together. "Yes, Michael, it's real. They arrested Victor Leland, and we have evidence this time. Real evidence." Michael was quiet for a long moment. Porter heard him breathing, heard what might have been a stifled sob. "Thank you," Michael said finally. "Thank you for not giving up, for not forgetting. Your parents deserved justice." "Yeah." Michael's voice steadied. "Yeah, they did. Sarah called me. She saw the news, too. We're both coming up for the trial. We haven't been in the same room in probably 15 years, but we're going to be there, together, for them." The trial began on February 14, 2011, Valentine's Day, in the Clatsop County Circuit Court. D.A. Chen had brought in Special Prosecutor Thomas Brennan from the Attorney General's office, a veteran trial lawyer with a track record of winning complex cases. The courtroom was packed from day one. All 7 of the now adult children were there. Michael Holmes, now 55, his Navy bearing still evident in how he sat. Sarah Holmes Bradley, 52, a school counselor from Beaverton. Patricia Gibbons, 58, who'd become a nurse. David Gibbons, 56, who worked in construction like his father. Elizabeth Gibbons, 53, who'd moved to Seattle but came back for this. They sat in the front row on the prosecution's side, family members together for the first time in decades. The defense team was formidable: Richard Holloway and 2 associates from Portland's most prestigious white-collar defense firm. But they faced an uphill battle. Special Prosecutor Brennan's opening statement was devastating in its simplicity. "In August 1968, 4 people went fishing," he began, standing before the jury without notes. "Robert and Jennifer Holmes, Frank and Mary Gibbons. They were parents, workers, friends. They left 7 children at home that Sunday morning, expecting to be back by dinner time. Those children never saw their parents again." He paused, letting that sink in. For 42 years, those children, now adults, now grandparents themselves, believed their parents died in an accident, a tragic accident caused by a poorly maintained pier. But it wasn't an accident. His voice hardened. It was murder. Premeditated, calculated, cold-blooded murder committed in service of profit. He walked to the evidence table and picked up a photograph of the sabotaged piling. "The evidence will show that Victor Leland hired someone to cut through the support pilings of Pier 9. He knew this would cause the pier to collapse. He knew people would die. He didn't know who, and he didn't care. He just needed a catastrophic failure, something dramatic enough to force the city of Astoria to approve his development plans." Brennan returned to face the jury. "And when 4 people did die, when Robert Holmes, Jennifer Holmes, Frank Gibbons, and Mary Gibbons were crushed under tons of falling debris, Victor Leland paid his accomplice, Wallace Kern, $50,000 in consulting fees. Then he built his marina, and he got rich." He let that statement hang in the air. "The defense will try to convince you that this is all speculation, that we can't prove Mr. Leland ordered the sabotage, but you will see the physical evidence, the saw cuts in the pilings that could only have been made deliberately. You will read Wallace Kern's confession, given on his deathbed when he had nothing to gain and everything to lose. You will see the money trail, you will hear the motive, and you will know, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Victor Leland is guilty of 4 counts of murder." Over the next 3 weeks, Brennan methodically built his case. He called Dr. Rachel Kim first. She spent an entire day on the stand, explaining in clear, accessible language how the pilings had been sabotaged. The jury passed around photographs showing the saw marks. One juror, a retired carpenter, asked to examine them more closely. "Dr. Kim, in your professional opinion, were these cuts made deliberately?" Brennan asked. "Yes, without question." "Could they have occurred naturally through rot or deterioration?" "No, rotted wood doesn't fail in this pattern. These are tool marks, specifically marks made by a two-man crosscut saw. And when were these cuts made? Based on the compression patterns in the wood fibers, these cuts were made while the pier was still standing and bearing weight, days or weeks before the collapse. Holloway tried to shake her on cross-examination. "Dr. Kim, isn't it possible these cuts were made during the demolition work in 1971? No. How can you be certain? Because of the compression patterns I mentioned. If the cuts had been made after the pier collapsed, when the pilings were no longer under load, those patterns wouldn't exist. The physical evidence is conclusive. These pilings were cut before the collapse, not after." Brennan called the archaeologist who'd supervised the excavation, who testified to the chain of custody and the documentation process. He called the notary from Phoenix, who'd witnessed Kern's signature, who confirmed that Kern had been lucid and insistent about making the statement. Then he entered Kern's confession into evidence. Brennan read portions of it aloud to the jury. "Leland offered me $50,000 to falsify inspection reports. He called me the morning of August 18th and said, 'Today's the day.' He hired someone to cut through the support pilings. I buried the wreckage to hide the evidence." Holloway objected repeatedly. "Hearsay, Your Honor. Mr. Kern is dead. He can't be cross-examined." But Judge Sorensen allowed the confession under the dying declaration exception. Mr. Kern made this statement knowing he was dying, with nothing to gain from lying. The court finds it admissible. The financial evidence was damning. Brennan called a forensic accountant who'd traced the payments from Leland to Kern, $25,000 in January 1968, another $25,000 in February 1969. "Were these payments documented as consulting fees?" Brennan asked. "Yes, but there's no record of what consulting work Mr. Kern supposedly performed. No contracts, no invoices, no work product, just two large cash payments. Is that unusual? For a corporation the size of Leland Development? Extremely. They had strict accounting procedures for all consulting work. These payments stand out as anomalies." Then came the testimony from the children. Patricia Gibbons went first. She was 58 now, but when she described waiting for her parents to come home that August day, she was 16 again, setting the table for a dinner they'd never eat. "I was making potato salad," she said, her voice steady, but her hands gripping the edge of the witness box. "My mom's recipe. I kept looking out the window, watching for their truck. When the police car pulled up instead, I knew. I just knew something terrible had happened." "What impact did your parents' deaths have on your life?" Brennan asked gently. Patricia looked at Leland, who sat impassively at the defense table. "I was 16. My sister Elizabeth was 11. Our brother David was 14. We lost our parents, our home, our whole world in one afternoon. My uncle took us in, but it wasn't the same. I had to grow up instantly. I couldn't be a teenager anymore. I had to help take care of my siblings. I missed my high school graduation because Elizabeth was sick, and there was nobody else to stay with her." She paused, composing herself. "But that's not the worst part. The worst part is growing up thinking it was just bad luck, just a terrible accident. Finding out 42 years later that it wasn't an accident at all, that someone killed them deliberately for money. I don't have words for what that feels like." Michael Holmes's testimony was even more powerful. He described going to the sheriff's office at 16, demanding they investigate further, being told there was nothing to investigate. "I knew something was wrong," he said. "The timing was too perfect. The pier had been there for decades, used by hundreds of people, and it just happened to collapse exactly when my parents were bringing their boat in. I told them that. I told them it couldn't be a coincidence." "What did they say?" Brennan asked. "They said I was upset, that I was looking for someone to blame, that sometimes accidents just happen." Michael's jaw tightened. "So I joined the Navy. I left Astoria and never came back. I didn't go to my sister's wedding, didn't meet my niece and nephew until they were teenagers. Because this town, this place, it took my parents and then told me I was crazy for thinking there was more to the story. He looked directly at the jury. For 42 years, I thought I was wrong, that I was just an angry kid who couldn't accept that bad things happen. Now I know I was right, and the person responsible is sitting right there. He pointed at Leland. He killed my parents. For a marina. For money. The defense strategy became clear when Holloway began his case. Attack Kern's credibility and create reasonable doubt about the physical evidence. Holloway called character witnesses for Leland, business associates who praised his integrity, charity officials who spoke of his generosity, longtime employees who described him as ethical and fair. But Brennan destroyed this in cross-examination. Did Mr. Leland ever mention his business dealings with Wallace Kern? He asked each witness. None of them had even heard Kern's name. Did you know about the two payments totaling $50,000 that Mr. Leland made to Mr. Kern in 1968 and 1969? None of them did. Were you aware that Mr. Leland had submitted multiple development proposals for the Astoria waterfront that were rejected before the pier collapse, but were approved after it? Most weren't aware of the pre-collapse rejections. Holloway called his own engineering expert, Dr. Martin Sheffield from Stanford, who testified that the saw marks could theoretically have been made during the 1971 demolition work. Dr. Kim was recalled for rebuttal. She methodically took apart Sheffield's testimony, pointing to specific features of the wood compression that proved the cuts predated the collapse. Dr. Sheffield is theorizing, she said calmly. I'm presenting physical evidence. The evidence doesn't lie. The defense didn't call Victor Leland to testify. It was too risky. If he took the stand, Brennan would eviscerate him on cross-examination. In his closing argument, Holloway did his best with what he had. The state is asking you to convict a 79-year-old man of murder based on the word of a dead, corrupt official and some cuts in 40-year-old wood. Wallace Kern was demonstrably corrupt. He falsified inspections. He took bribes. He buried evidence. Why should we believe anything he says? Holloway paced in front of the jury box. The state wants you to believe that Victor Leland, a respected businessman, orchestrated an elaborate murder plot that required hiring someone to do underwater sabotage, waiting for the pier to collapse, and then covering it up for 40 years. All for a marina? Does that really make sense? He pointed to the engineering report. The state's own evidence from 1968 shows that pier was severely rotted. It was going to collapse eventually. Maybe Wallace Kern, in his guilty conscience, convinced himself that the collapse was deliberate when it was really just the inevitable result of poor maintenance that he was responsible for. Maybe his deathbed confession was his way of transferring guilt, of blaming Victor Leland for his own failures. It was a clever argument, but it had to overcome a mountain of evidence. Brennan's closing was brief and devastating. Victor Leland needed that pier to fail, he began. He'd submitted proposal after proposal for waterfront development, and the city kept saying no. They wanted to preserve the working waterfront. He couldn't change their minds with words, so he changed them with blood. He walked to the evidence table and picked up Kern's confession. Wallace Kern was corrupt, yes. He took money to falsify inspections. But he didn't confess to that. We already knew about that from the 1968 investigation. He confessed to something new, that Victor Leland paid him to help cover up murder. Why would he invent that? He was dying. He had nothing to gain. Brennan set down the confession and picked up the photograph of the sabotaged piling. And the physical evidence supports exactly what Kern said. The pilings were deliberately cut. Dr. Kim proved that beyond any doubt. Dr. Sheffield's theory that they might have been cut during demolition was disproven by the compression patterns. The defense has no explanation for how those cuts got there, because there is no explanation except the truth. Sabotage. He faced the jury directly. 4 people died on August 18, 1968. Robert Holmes, Jennifer Holmes, Frank Gibbons, Mary Gibbons. They died because Victor Leland wanted to build a marina, and they were in the way. Not personally in the way. They had nothing to do with zoning or development proposals. They just had the misfortune of being on a pier that Leland needed to collapse. Brennan's voice dropped, but intensified. That's the obscenity of this crime. Leland didn't even know who he was killing. He didn't care. Any 4 people would have served his purpose. It just happened to be them. Parents, workers, friends, good people who left 7 children orphaned. He paused. The defense asks you if it makes sense that someone would commit murder for a marina. But people commit murder for much less every day. And Leland didn't just get a marina. He got millions of dollars. He got a business empire. He got 42 years of freedom while 7 children grew up without parents. Brennan walked back to the prosecution table. The evidence is overwhelming. The saw marks prove sabotage. Kern's confession explains who and why. The money trail confirms payment. The motive is clear. And the defendant had 4 decades to enjoy the fruits of his crime. He looked at each juror in turn. Give Robert, Jennifer, Frank, and Mary justice. After 42 years, they deserve at least that much. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On March 9, 2011, at 2:47 p.m., they returned with a verdict. The courtroom was packed. The 7 children sat together in the front row, holding hands. David Porter sat behind them, hardly breathing. Reporters filled the gallery. Judge Sorensen read the verdict herself. In the matter of the state of Oregon versus Victor Leland on the charge of murder in the first degree of Robert Holmes, how do you find? The jury foreman, a retired teacher in her 60s, stood. Guilty. On the charge of murder in the first degree of Jennifer Holmes? Guilty. On the charge of murder in the first degree of Frank Gibbons? Guilty. On the charge of murder in the first degree of Mary Gibbons? Guilty. 4 guilty verdicts, 4 counts of murder, 4 lives finally accounted for. Victor Leland sat perfectly still, his face expressionless. Only his hands, gripping the edge of the defense table, betrayed any emotion. In the front row, Sarah Holmes Bradley put her head on her brother's shoulder and wept. Michael wrapped his arm around her, his own eyes wet. The Gibbons siblings held each other. Outside the courthouse 20 minutes later, Michael Holmes faced a wall of reporters and cameras. Sarah stood beside him, still holding his hand. Justice took 42 years, Michael said, his voice hoarse. But it came. My parents, all 4 of them, didn't die in an accident. They were murdered. For a marina. For money. And now everyone knows it. A reporter asked, "What do you want to happen to Victor Leland?" Michael looked back at the courthouse. "I want him to spend whatever time he has left in prison, thinking about what he did, thinking about my mom setting up her classroom for the school year she never got to teach, thinking about my dad carefully bringing that boat in, having no idea someone had sabotaged the dock. I want him to think about 7 children going to bed that night without parents. I want that to be his last thought every night for whatever time he has left." Sentencing was scheduled for April 15, 2011. Judge Sorensen heard victim impact statements from all 7 children. Patricia Gibbons spoke about missing having her mother at her wedding, at the birth of her children, at every major moment in her life. David spoke about learning carpentry from books instead of from his father. Elizabeth described the recurring nightmare she'd had for 40 years, watching her parents' truck pull up, running to the door, and no one being there. Michael Holmes's statement was the shortest and most powerful. I'm 55 years old. For 42 of those years, 3/4 of my life, I've lived with a hole where my parents should have been. Every achievement, every failure, every major life decision, I had to face it without them. I got married. They weren't there. My children were born. They never met their grandparents. I retired from the Navy after 26 years of service. I had no one to celebrate with. He looked at Leland. You didn't just kill 4 people. You killed futures. You killed graduations and weddings and grandchildren and Sunday dinners and all the small moments that make a life. You did that for money. I don't forgive you. I never will. And I hope that every day you have left, you remember what you stole. When it was time for sentencing, Judge Sorensen spoke for nearly 20 minutes, her statement a comprehensive condemnation of everything Leland had done. Mr. Leland, you orchestrated the murder of 4 innocent people to advance your business interests. You turned their deaths into profit. You lived in luxury for 42 years while their children grew up without parents, while their families marked birthdays and holidays with empty chairs at the table. She paused. You have shown no remorse, no empathy, no recognition of the magnitude of your crimes. You sit here today not because you were caught in 1968, but because a dying man's conscience finally compelled the truth to emerge. Without Wallace Kern's confession, you would have died wealthy and respected, your crimes unknown. Her voice hardened. The law allows me to impose 4 consecutive life sentences. That is what you will receive. You will spend the rest of your life in prison. You will die there. And that is far less than you deserve. She brought down the gavel. 4 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. Victor Leland was 79 years old. He had multiple health issues, including diabetes and heart disease. Nobody expected him to survive long in custody. He was transferred to the Oregon State Penitentiary on April 20th, 2011. The prison medical staff immediately flagged him as high risk due to his age and medical conditions. He lasted 18 months. On November 3, 2012, exactly 2 years after his arrest, Victor Leland died of a heart attack in the prison infirmary. He was 80 years old. For the families, the end didn't come with Leland's death. It came 3 months earlier, on August 18, 2012, the 44th anniversary of the pier collapse. The Port Authority, in cooperation with the city of Astoria, had erected a memorial at the waterfront near where Pier 9 had stood. 4 bronze plaques mounted on black granite, each bearing a name and photograph. Robert Holmes, 1930-1968, loving father and friend. Jennifer Holmes, 1933-1968, dedicated teacher. Frank Gibbons, 1926-1968, master craftsman. Mary Gibbons, 1928-1968, beloved mother and gardener. Below the plaques, an inscription. In memory of 4 lives lost. August 18, 1968. Taken not by accident, but by greed. Never forgotten by those who loved them. The dedication ceremony was small and dignified. All 7 children were there. Michael had flown in from San Diego with his wife and adult children. Sarah brought her family from Portland. The Gibbons siblings came together. Patricia had brought her grandchildren. The great-grandchildren Frank and Mary never got to meet. There were 11 of them now, ranging in age from 3 to 17. David Porter attended, standing at a respectful distance until Sarah saw him and beckoned him over. "You're part of this," she said simply. "You made it happen." Dr. Rachel Kim was there too, having driven down from Portland where she was guest lecturing at Oregon State. The mayor spoke briefly. D.A. Margaret Chen gave remarks about the importance of justice, no matter how long delayed. But the speeches that mattered came from the family. Sarah Holmes Bradley spoke for all of them, her voice clear and steady. For 44 years, We've lived with a hole in our lives where our parents should have been. Graduations they missed, weddings they didn't attend, grandchildren they never met. For most of that time, we believed it was just terrible luck. An accident, one of those random tragedies that happens sometimes. She looked at her brother, then at the Gibbons siblings. Finding out it wasn't an accident was somehow both worse and better. Worse because someone chose to kill them. Someone decided their lives were worth less than a business opportunity. But better because it gave us something the accident never could, the truth. And the truth led to justice. She turned to Porter. We owe that to Mr. Porter, who cared enough about 4 people he never met to spend months researching their deaths, who listened when Michael said something didn't feel right, who kept digging when everyone else had moved on. Sarah looked back at the memorial. Our parents were ordinary people. They worked hard. They loved their families. They went fishing on Sundays. They deserved long lives full of those simple pleasures. Instead, they got 42 years of being forgotten, treated as nothing more than a statistic in an old case file. Her voice strengthened. But not anymore. Now everyone knows Robert and Jennifer Holmes, Frank and Mary Gibbons. They know these weren't just names. They were real people with real families who loved them. And they know that the man who killed them paid for it. That matters. Justice matters. Truth matters. She stepped back, and Michael moved forward. He'd brought 4 fishing rods, vintage models from the 1960s that he'd found at an antique shop. My dad taught me to fish, he said quietly. He was patient and thorough, and he made it fun. The last time we went fishing together, I was 12. I caught a steelhead almost as big as me, and he was so proud. That's my last memory of him, being proud of me. Michael placed one of the fishing rods against the memorial. I never fished again after he died. Couldn't do it. But my son loves fishing. I couldn't teach him. That was too hard. But he learned anyway, from YouTube videos and fishing guides and his own determination, and he's good at it. Really good. He smiled sadly. I like to think my dad would be proud of that too, that his grandson carries on that tradition even without having known him. The other children came forward one by one, each leaving something at the memorial. Patricia left her mother's favorite flowers, roses which Mary had grown in her garden. David left one of his father's old woodworking tools, a plane that he'd kept all these years. Elizabeth left a book from the library where her mother had worked. Then Sarah's daughter, also named Sarah after her grandmother, stepped forward. She was 20 now, in college, studying to be a teacher, like the grandmother she'd never met. I was named for someone I never knew, young Sarah said, but I've spent my whole life hearing stories about her, how she made her students feel special, how she had a laugh that made everyone around her happy, how she loved my mom so much. She placed a framed photograph at the memorial. Jennifer Holmes in her classroom, surrounded by second graders, all of them smiling. I became a teacher because of her, because of the stories, because I wanted to be like the grandmother I never got to meet. And whenever I'm in my classroom, working with my students, I feel like she's there with me somehow, like I'm carrying on something she started. Young Sarah stepped back, and for a long moment everyone stood in silence, looking at the memorial. Then Patricia's youngest grandchild, 3-year-old Emma, broke free from her mother's hand and walked up to Frank Gibbons's plaque. She touched it with one small hand. "Where's Great-Grandpa?" she asked. Her mother started to pull her back, but Patricia stopped her. "It's okay," Patricia said. She knelt down next to Emma. "Great-Grandpa isn't here anymore, sweetheart. He died a long time ago, before even your mommy was born. But we remember him. That's what this is for, so we always remember." "Why did he die?" Patricia looked at the memorial, at her father's name in bronze letters. "A bad man hurt him," she said simply, "but the bad man got in trouble, and now we make sure everybody remembers that great-grandpa was a good man who loved his family." Emma nodded seriously, seeming to understand in the way children sometimes do. She patted the plaque one more time, then returned to her mother. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence, all of them standing together at the waterfront where Pier 9 had once stood, where their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had died 44 years ago. When it was over, the family gathered at a local restaurant for dinner. All 7 siblings plus spouses, children, and grandchildren, 28 people filling 3 long tables. Michael stood and raised his glass. "To Robert and Jennifer Holmes, to Frank and Mary Gibbons, parents we lost too soon, people who deserved better. May they rest in peace, finally knowing that justice came for them." "To justice," everyone echoed. They drank, and then they ate, and they told stories about parents and grandparents that most of them had never known. The stories had been told so many times they'd taken on the quality of myth, but that didn't make them less true. The story of Frank building Patricia's first dollhouse, crafted with such precision that every drawer actually opened. The story of Mary's tomatoes winning first prize at the county fair 5 years running. The story of Jennifer staying after school every day for a month to help a struggling student learn to read. The story of Robert organizing a fundraiser when a co-worker's house burned down, raising enough money to rebuild it. Small stories, ordinary stories, the kind that make up a life. And now, finally, those lives were fully known, not just as victims of a tragedy, but as people who mattered, who were loved, who were remembered. 3 years later, in 2015, David Porter's book, Beneath the Harbor, The True Story of the Pier 9 Murders, was published by a regional press. It became a bestseller in Oregon and Washington, went through 3 printings, and was optioned for a true crime documentary. Porter donated all his proceeds to a scholarship fund established in the names of Robert Holmes, Jennifer Holmes, Frank Gibbons, and Mary Gibbons. The fund supported students from Astoria pursuing careers in teaching, carpentry, library science, and maritime trades, the professions the 4 had worked in. By 2024, the fund had provided scholarships to 43 students. Dr. Rachel Kim included the Pier 9 case in her textbook, Structural Failures, Analysis and Prevention, which became required reading in engineering programs across the country. An entire chapter was devoted to deliberate sabotage and how to detect it forensically. The case was studied in law schools as an example of how cold cases could be solved through persistence and modern forensic techniques. It was taught in police academies as a lesson in thorough evidence preservation and the importance of listening when people say, "Something doesn't feel right." The Port Authority implemented new safety protocols across all its facilities, annual third-party inspections, mandatory reporting of structural concerns, and a complete overhaul of its record-keeping systems. The reforms were eventually adopted by port authorities throughout the Pacific Northwest. And in Astoria, the memorial remained. The bronze plaques, weathered but still clear. Every August 18th, someone left flowers. Sometimes it was family members. Sometimes it was locals who'd heard the story. Sometimes it was strangers who'd read Porter's book and made the pilgrimage. The Columbia River flowed on, as it always had and always would. The harbor was modern now, safe and well-maintained. Children played on the waterfront. Fishermen launched from new docks that were inspected and certified and safe. And beneath it all, in memory if not in fact, 4 people remained. Robert Holmes, Jennifer Holmes, Frank Gibbons, Mary Gibbons. Murdered for profit, forgotten for 42 years, finally remembered, finally honored, finally given justice. Michael Holmes died in 2019 at age 63 of complications from diabetes. At his funeral, his children spoke of how he'd lived his whole life in the shadow of his parents' deaths, how the trial and conviction had finally given him some measure of peace. Sarah Holmes Bradley continued her work as a school counselor, helping children through trauma and loss, drawing on her own experience. She spoke frequently at conferences about the long-term effects of violent loss and the importance of truth and justice in healing. Patricia Gibbons became a hospice nurse, caring for dying patients with a gentleness born of understanding what loss meant. She often sat with families in their final moments, helping them say goodbye. David Gibbons took over his father's old woodshop in Astoria and taught carpentry to young people, passing on skills he'd learned from books and practice since his father wasn't there to teach him. Elizabeth Gibbons wrote a memoir in 2020 about growing up as an orphan, about the trial, about finally getting answers. It was published by a small press and received strong reviews. All of them, in their own ways, carried on, scarred by what had happened, but not destroyed by it, making lives that their parents would have been proud of. And every August 18th, those who remained gathered at the memorial, fewer each year as age and illness took their toll, and remembered. Remembered 4 ordinary people who went fishing on a Sunday morning and never came home. Remembered 7 children who grew up too fast. Remembered a retired teacher who looked at an old map and asked why. Remembered that justice, however delayed, still mattered. Remembered that truth, however long buried, deserved to be told. 4 lives lost, 42 years waiting. One truth revealed: justice.